So, welcome back to another EURA Seminar. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Helen Eenmaa, who is also a very dear friend of mine. We met at Yale some years ago while I was doing my LLM and she was doing her JSD. But now she is a researcher and founder of the IT Law program at the University of Tartu School of Law in Estonia. Estonia is a country that is very much advanced in the debate around technology regulation, about AI, doing a lot of interesting initiatives also with judges. Yesterday we had a speaker discussing judges adjudicating cases that are non-humans. But today we'll move on to a different topic with Helen presenting a paper, one of her recent papers on machines that make and keep promises. So without any further ado, I'll leave her the floor and thank her for being here with us, physically in Pisa and with the people that are connecting online. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Andrea. Thank you everyone for being here, and to everyone online, welcome and thank you for taking your time to join this discussion. I hope it's going to be a fruitful one and interesting, and I definitely very much look forward to hearing your feedback to this work, because of course it is always a work in progress. Once you publish a paper, you already have ideas about the next one, and this is definitely the case over here as well. But before actually focusing on the paper itself and the discussions around it, I wanted to tell you a story from a few years ago, which also sort of helps to characterize, I think, my attitude towards technology discussions, technology regulation more generally. So a few years ago, we organized a cybersecurity summer school together with researchers at the Tallinn University of Technology. And it's been a long tradition already in terms of cooperating with computer scientists for us at the law school in Tartu. So we have had multiple joint projects, and the IT law program, the slides of which you see here, was also something that I founded at the University of Tartu, but was a joint project with the computer scientists. So we organized this summer school on cybersecurity. It was focused on digital evidence, and we brought together basically computer science students, mostly doctoral students, and law students, mostly also doctoral students. The idea was, of course, to introduce the computer scientists to the legal discussions on digital evidence, and also to teach the legal scholars how to understand and do technical work with digital evidence, because eventually what matters is that they have those skills so that the court proceedings would go in a high quality manner. And to do this summer school, we had a wonderful international team. We had lawyers from different countries. We had an international team of techies. And among the lawyers, there was a barrister from the UK who had a side career as a very successful spy novelist and writer of murder mysteries. So, using his skills, we decided to come up with a case for the students that they could solve. And, well, if you do a course on digital evidence, it's actually fun to write up a murder mystery where there is loads of evidence that the students would have to work through and then figure out their path through it, which is what we did. The barrister wrote up a case, and we, the techies, lawyers, piled up loads of evidence that could potentially be affiliated with the case, but could also not be, so there was really lots of material. And during the weeks of the summer school, the student groups had to work through this evidence and figure out what the story was, what had actually happened, and there was definitely a murder there, but they didn't know exactly the story around it. And their task was to figure out what to do as lawyers about this case, so how to proceed as lawyers in the case. The data was cross-jurisdictional. The main subjects were Estonian, but a lot of action took place in the US and in Germany. So the students took their time, and then at some point they started coming back to us with their versions of what had happened, what they were able to gather from the evidence, and they also were offering then their plan of action for acting upon the case. So they were meant to show how to handle it as lawyers. So many of them had discovered gaps in the evidence and had seen that they actually need additional evidence from the US law enforcement. And, well, for some reason, US was not willing to share it. So the lawyers and the team immediately suggested that, hey, we should use the data extraction order. We should just get the evidence by having the Estonian police make an official request for evidence to the US through court proceedings. And of course, in Europe, we are used to getting the police to cooperate and compiling digital evidence thanks to common EU policies. The cross-border requests for data exchange are quite common. And they are complied with, and so nobody had a second thought about this case. Of course, this was the way to access the data. Of course, you go and ask for it through the court proceedings, except, until it became clear that this analogy was false. Now, which lawyer in their right mind would actually recommend their government to take US to court? So, especially when this involves a small country like Estonia, which is really dependent on the relations with large countries, where the relations between the countries matter so much more than what happens in that particular case in terms of the evidence. So as a government, you just don't do that. You don't take a very significant partner in international relations to court to get evidence from them. And as a lawyer working for the government, you don't recommend that to your government. So this is not the place where to go forward with the law, with the full force of law, but you do use diplomacy, you use the inside connections, you think about what would be important for you in the long term. So the point, of course, here is that the context matters so much, and you don't, as a lawyer, not only need to work with law, and you don't need to work with the legal practice, but you need to be aware of legal practice across jurisdictions, so that the recommendations that you make sense in the cross-jurisdictional context, in the context of international relations, and thinking about yesterday's discussions in the workshops, also the context of relations between states and legal tech companies. So we've tried to keep this kind of view in mind also when thinking about contract automation and its regulation, and the kinds of lessons we learn from various markets about regulating contract automation. Now, Andrea already introduced my background briefly in terms of the IT law program, but this particular paper is connected to a research project, or initiative rather, which we call Contract Automation Society, or looking at the first letter CAS, endearingly using an acronym Cassandra, which refers to a Trojan princess in Greek mythology who always told the truth but was never believed or trusted. So algorithmic contracts are like the Trojan princess Cassandra. They always tell the truth, that is, they always act exactly as programmed, but they are rarely believed and trusted. And so this workshop is about such algorithmic contracts. I will make preliminary remarks in order to show you what the discussion is about more generally, and to sort of give you an idea about what to look for in the paper that I co-wrote with Maria Jose Schmidt-Kessen. I should actually go to the next slide, so hopefully this works. So I co-wrote the paper with Maria Jose Schmidt-Kessen from the Central European University and Maja Mitre from Copenhagen Business School. And they had a very significant role in both writing the paper as well as contributing actually thoughts to this talk. So I think this is something that I'm very grateful for to them, and they're definitely a huge part of this project. But it's also a third paper that I have written with Maria Jose Schmidt-Kessen. The first was on creating markets in no-trust environments, and the second was on smart contracts reducing risks in economic exchange, ? They were both published in 2019, and actually also triggered a discussion that this paper is based on. So for us, the trigger for writing the paper was a conversation I had with a computer scientist who resurfaced the paradox related to smart contracts for me. This person was Marlon Dumas, who is currently running his ERC Advanced Grant on Business Process Management at the University of Tartu, and he's a good colleague of mine. And the paradox is the following. There's a criticism against contract automation, which props up the view that we would do better by not using smart or algorithmic contracts at all. Marlon had read the paper that we had written, and the paper itself explained how contract enforcement mechanisms match up with different trust relationships in these contracting systems. And so Marlon's remark was that smart contracts are generally presented as a tool for decentralizing contracting, but this gives a wrong impression. They promise to eliminate dispute resolution mechanisms that typically come along with traditional contracts and their electronic counterparts, and they are presented as tools to finalize transactions in a manner that conventional contracts cannot do. But his claim was that the contracts give a wrong impression, and that such contracts are inflexible to the extent that they cancel themselves out. So the criticism rests on the premise that smart contracts are inflexible, and as such they face a dilemma, either being an unimportant development on the markets or having only limited applicability. And I will leave it like that for now, and I will come back to this later, but briefly, this conclusion seemed too hasty for us, so we thought that it was a high time to re-examine the criticism, and in the process of responding to it in our paper, we were able to say several essential things about the underlying values of contracting, the economic theory, and the regulation of risks on the markets. Particularly the financial market and other markets using contract automation. And now, building on this motivation for the paper, the purpose here is, I think, to briefly explain the content of the criticism to you, and then show how we questioned it on the basis of transaction cost economics, and then also show how this how it was very helpful for us to look at the case study on financial markets and what this actually eventually showed us about connecting the inflexibility problem with economic theory and distinguishing different markets where we regulate algorithmic contracting. But first, now to the definitions. So you see two graphs here. They actually meant to be one graph, but I have put both of them up here because I think it's up for a debate which of them is more accurate. Both of them are made by Florian Edelberger, and the one on the left is made earlier, the one on the right is made a bit later. But generally what those graphs characterize is that contracting can be automated in various ways. In brief, for a definition, a smart contract is an executable code. When specific conditions obtain, it triggers a follow-on action. And these encoded instructions do not necessarily amount to a legally binding agreement or contract, but it is possible to use them to automate the execution of binding contractual conditions. It's important to see that many other advanced forms of contract automation require little or no human involvement, as these graphs show. So they might not require centralized orchestration of transactions at all. And here we can talk about computable contracts, algorithmic contracts, recurring contracts, and e-contracts. Also, the automation of contracts might concern some stages of a contract's life cycle, but also all the stages of a contract's life cycle. So to cover all these variants for the paper, we use the term algorithmic contracts for simplification, but it's of course a further debate what is the accurate terminology. And I know Florian, whose graphs you just saw, has been writing his PhD on this topic, which he will defend at the UI later this year. So I'm very hopeful that he will be able to fill this gap in the literature. But for our paper, we decided to use the term algorithmic contracts, which Lawrence Schultz has defined as contracts containing terms determined by an algorithm rather than a person. So quite a broad definition. Now, such contracts are inflexible. This means that when we automate some or all stages of a contract's lifecycle, potentially from search and drafting to performance and enforcement, we limit our options to adjust or modify the contract later. And how is that? First, it is challenging for such contracts to consider and accommodate the changing circumstances in everyday life. This is something that traditional contracts can do well, but not algorithmic contracts. And suppose the computer code, for example, which a truth is an if and then instructions, must be wholly and precisely defined for a computer to execute it. It is very costly to program it. So it's a challenge to program such contracts. And secondly, they're inflexible in another way as well. Even when when the code of the contract includes intervention functions. So, for example, we want to make the contract more flexible, and we do include various ways where somebody can come in and change the path of the contract. Those intervention functions are only executed at the moments that the coder has envisioned. So the execution is based on the explicit and very precise instructions that were foreseen when the code was launched. And this means that the interventions themselves are also inflexible. So the inflexibility of smart contracts and automated contracts more generally is a well-known fact. It's an established fact. It's indebatable, and it has led to the criticism of algorithmic contracting. The critics claim that such contracts are inflexible to the extent that they cancel themselves out, in the sense that they cannot be applied. And so in the spirit of good old philosophical argumentation, we took this criticism and wanted to see how far we can develop it to make it the strongest challenge for us as possible. And so here's one of those results that we got to. So looking deeper into the criticism, we see that it presents the contracts with an impossible dilemma. Smart contracts can be applied only in very limited circumstances, and if someone wanted to remedy that, these contracts would lose their innovative edge, becoming an insignificant development in the markets. The limited application argument is basically the first leg of the dilemma, and it points to the fact that the range of application scenarios for such contracts is minimal, and also the contracting efficiency is low. They would just not be applied. And the second leg of the dilemma is the marginal innovation argument. The idea is that one could make smart contracts more flexible to give them more applicability. This could be done, for example, by setting up a system of oversight on top of an automated contracting platform. The problem is that this seems to defeat the original purpose of smart contracts being tools of disintermediation and tools for finalizing transactions. If you set up oversight to overturn the effects of smart contracts, then smart contracts would just be an evolutionary step on top of electronic data interchange, and this would be a marginal innovation, not a disruptive one, as the developers of smart contracts claim. So if the critics are right, smart contracts could not be really a path to optimizing contracting and gaining benefits from their application in the society. Now on to questioning this criticism and using the tools of transaction cost economics to do that. We built our response using transaction cost economics, but more broadly rational choice theory and economic analysis of law. Because prior work in these fields tells us that limiting or constraining action can help to pursue more significant benefits than not constraining action. In moral philosophy and legal theory, this is known through the discussion of constraint maximization. The theory of rational choice explains how, in the presence of various constraints, the behavior of actors is a constant optimization. And the word of constraint is central here. Both rational choice theory and institutional economics are useful for understanding how constraining behavior or limiting options for individuals on the micro level can help to pursue societal goals on the macro level. And we draw a parallel between inflexibility and constraints. So algorithmic inflexibility is also a constraint in the sense that it limits action. And also legal norms, for example, or physical barriers, or software architecture related boundaries limit action. a city architecture is not usually there to restrict movement, but to enable it in a particular manner, but it does restrict action as well. And similarly, contracting algorithms restrict actions, but they are not necessarily there to limit the action, but to enable it in a specific way, right? So they constrain action, but they also there to have an instrumental purpose. So, and it is quite common to use constraints like social norms or institutions and other mechanisms for coordinating individual actions, so to use them in an instrumental manner. But how do constraints work? So I was thinking that maybe it's good to think for a moment on something that's outside the scope of algorithmic contracting, just to have a good parallel example. And I thought of explaining this through climate change. So how do constraints work through the perspective of climate change? The conclusions are similar, basically, to those we'd reach when discussing the operation of markets. So dealing with climate change is like a textbook example of the problem of collective action, of course. It's helpful to look at it through the lenses of the tragedy of the commons and rational choice theory and economic analysis of law. They help to say something useful about both the problem and the solution. The tragedy of the commons means that the community has a shared resource, say a piece of land, and well, it ends up being depleted because people tend to overuse it in their own interests, and the result is an overexploited resource, which is not in anyone's long-term interests. Rational choice theory helps to understand why this is the case and how the best long-term results could be achieved in such a case. The key to the solution is cooperation and low transaction costs. Think about transaction costs first. If there is no time, no trust, no information, then collaboration is too expensive for an individual. And at the same time, these conditions can be improved. One option is to use regulation to bring down transaction costs in the right place and to create conditions for better communication among individuals. It would also be possible to use regulation for securing cooperation. That would be useful for the individual members. So in some rational choice theory delivers the idea that a rational actor would forego immediate benefits for securing cooperation, which is in his long-term interest. And in some circumstances, it is in our long-term interest to adopt the rules that constrain our actions. When we think about climate change, for example, we know that courts have been able to restrict the freedoms to prevent environmental damage for a long time already, but these limitations have had to be proportionate and justified considering the preservation of healthy living environment, which has become more fragile in the later years, which means that those restrictions are very likely to increase in the upcoming years as well. So what is becoming proportionate and justified in the long-term in the interest of the long-term preservation of healthy living environment is much more than it used to be before. So this development can be nicely summed up, I think, by reference to John Stuart Mill, whose quote you don't see here, because, well, as you know, he said, "My freedom ends where your freedom begins," but he did not mention time. So I thought he should have mentioned time there as well. And I rephrased it by saying, "My today's freedom ends where my long-term freedom begins," and I think it sums up the climate change example quite nicely, but time is an important factor in terms of considering how we constrain our behavior and in the interest of what. Of course, climate change is just one example of the problem of collective action. Markets experience the same. In some circumstances, constraining self-interest is in each person's rational interest because it helps to secure benefits, and constraints can bring greater benefits than not constraining self-interest in some circumstances. But not all constraints or cooperative strategies work, of course. There are constraints without which markets and their cooperation by competition model would not be possible, but there are only some of such constraints. For example, you could think of property rights, as Coase suggested. So using constraints is a way to create cooperation on the market. Using property rights is a way to create cooperation on the market. Additionally, some constraints can be used for enhancing cooperation for the pursuit of some goals. When you think about the example of climate change, constraining of self-interest and actually constraining freedom there as well is a kind of constraint. It secures more level playing field across generations and a long-term future. So in some, algorithmic inflexibility is also a constraint in the sense that it limits action, and it's needed for a system of algorithms-based cooperation to function. But as we suggest in the paper, there is not only one kind of algorithmic inflexibility, but there are two. There is the inflexibility of algorithms that individual transactions employ, and there's also inflexibility as a hypernym for the systemic risks that arise on the market because of employing algorithms. And this distinction is actually very useful. You could think of the first type of inflexibility as a constraint, operational primarily on the level of individual transactions. Here we can talk about limiting choices due to limitations in software architecture of the computable contracts. Computers can perform only the tasks that have been previously envisioned and written into the code. These constraints are possibly something like the fundamental characteristics of an environment that allow it to function. Algorithmic tools make the functioning of an algorithmic financial and other type of market and collaboration possible. They're just like minimal property rights that make the functioning of a liberal market possible. And theory tells us that individuals are willing to internalize the cost of using inflexible algorithms because this opens a door to the benefits of algorithmic markets for them. Now, in contrast, you could think of the second type of inflexibility, the systemic risks that arise on the market, as a structural problem that individual actors cannot solve. So why would such risks occur? For example, because of lower human involvement, because of higher speeds in contracting with algorithms, and the interdependency between many automated environments. And these inflexibilities call for interventions in the form of regulation, which would provide safeguards for weaker parties and for leveling the playing field. This distinction is quite an important one because, as we explain in the paper, different types of inflexibility necessitate different regulatory responses. And this is something we see confirmed both by our case study as well as the economic theory. There are many questions that the distinction between two kinds of inflexibility helps to ask. First, do all kinds of inflexibilities fall under the criticism we presented earlier? Which type of inflexibility has the regulation targeted on financial markets? And would the same approach be appropriate for steering the design and regulation of algorithmic contracts on other types of markets other than financial markets? So this is where our case study comes in. Financial markets help to explore these two kinds of inflexibility. One of the main claims of the critics of smart contracts is that the inflexibility inherent in smart contracts prevents their widespread adoption and has great disadvantages because of that. But with our case study on algorithmic trading on financial markets, we want to show that contrary to these claims, there is empirical evidence of widespread use of algorithmic contracts that have a very similar setup and function as smart contracts. Actually, going back, well, what is algorithmic trading? What's the parallel here? So algorithmic trading is defined in MiFID with the words here, and I won't read them because it won't be helpful, but what's important is to notice the parallel between how algorithmic trading is understood and how algorithmic contracts are understood. The execution algorithms are functionally similar on financial markets and across smart contracts. they execute the transaction autonomously according to the encoded instructions that they were given and at the speed that makes it impossible for humans to intervene in real time. And these are precisely the points that the definition of algorithmic trading brings out. That the trading is done automatically and it's without human intervention. Now, of course, we sometimes get the question, particularly from economists, whether algorithmic trading transactions are actually contracts. And well, actually they are. Looking at it as a lawyer, you see that there is a transaction happening and this transaction is compliant, or it sort of, it complies with the definition that we have for contracts in the principles of European contract law, but in also other codes of contract law. Basically, a contract is concluded if the parties intend to be legally bound and they reach a sufficient agreement without any further requirement. And this is what happens in the financial trades. If there is a sale of financial instruments, both parties to the sale intend to be legally bound, and once price and quantity are agreed, there is no further requirement in order to complete the transaction. So this provides further grounds for drawing the parallels between algorithmic trading on financial markets and advanced contract automation. But what does this empirical data from financial markets actually tell us about the theoretical conclusions in the paper? What kind of inflexibility is at the center of attention in the financial markets? Well, we see that algorithmic trading on financial markets involves similar inflexibilities as other forms of contract automation, but contrary to contract automation critics, this has not stopped the widespread adoption of algorithmic trading tools and strategies. In the case of financial markets, we can talk about a long history of algorithmic trading, which has intensified and become ever more sophisticated over the years. And so this shows that the use of automated trading must be efficient for the market participants. And at an individual level, any costs from these inflexibilities appeared to have been internalized at the individual level. At the same time, on the level of markets, we can talk about the second type of inflexibility, the systemic inflexibility. Adopting algorithmic trading has been a roller coaster ride due to the very nature of algorithmic trading. It is automated, it is disintermediated and faster than manual trading. Both the investment decision and execution algorithms are more vulnerable to machine-driven errors and biases than manual trading. And humans are unable to intervene in real time if any algorithm should malfunction. We can talk about malfunctioning algorithms causing strain on venue infrastructure, absorbing liquidity, and spreading the risks very quickly to the sphere of other market participants across markets. And this can lead to flash crashes and brief episodes of extreme volatility that may lead to temporary collapse of the market. These factors and additional information security concerns, coupled with widespread algorithmic trading, has caused systemic risks for the stability of financial markets. And this is what the regulation has tried to avoid. In the EU, we respond quite strictly to this. Initially, we had MiFID I, now we have MiFID II, which imposes even stronger obligations on all kinds of market participants and their behavior on the algorithmic trading, in the algorithmic trade. So the regulation addresses the algorithmic traders, the trading techniques, the venues that allow for algorithmic trading. It requires stress testing of algorithms, algorithmic supervision systems, and it also sets requirements for the design of algorithms. And of course, while the regulators sort of address this quite stringently, they have been at the same time interested in the automation in the markets. So it's not like the regulators want to ban it somehow, but they just want to organize it better. Automation on the markets was introduced with the hope that the objectivity of computers replaces the subjective human decision-making, which is prone to mistakes. And so this actually aligns with regulators' interests as well. So how to think of the mechanism of financial markets in the terminology of inflexibilities, constraints, and cooperation mechanisms? We can think of the electronic order book and its queuing architecture introduced in the process of automation as the cooperation mechanisms of automated financial markets. The adoption of algorithmic trading was, in a sense, the rational maximizer's response to electronic order books. The introduction of electronic order books made the use of algorithmic trading strategies the best strategy for traders to maximize predictability and their returns. And the rise and widespread use of algorithmic trading was neither hampered by the inflexibility of the algorithms that create the queues in electronic order books, nor the inflexibility of trading strategies. When we look at the regulation of financial markets, then the regulatory initiatives have been primarily focused on the systemic risks arising from the use of algorithms. And this is what we argue also. Financial regulations only target the second type of inflexibility, that is the systemic risks stemming from the use of algorithms, not the constraints imposed on individual transactions by algorithmic flexibilities. This same regulation, of course, imposes also costs at the level of individual transactions. When you look at the various requirements that the regulator sets out, those do impose the costs for the individuals who want to operate on the financial markets, or rather the companies. But that has not killed algorithmic trading as such. So as my co-author Maria Jose has nicely put it, a change in the transaction technology puts stress on the institutions governing the market transactions. Once algorithmic trading was adopted, this required new forms of regulation and supervision so that it would not become a net burden on society. So yeah, in sum, the case of financial markets really supports our conceptual distinctions. First, the one between two types of inflexibility in algorithmic contracting, and secondly also the distinction between the necessary regulatory responses. The fact that parties' actions are constrained by the inflexibility of algorithms on the level of individual transactions has not been at the center of regulatory measures on financial markets, and at the same time the second type of inflexibility has been. The systemic risks resulting from the employment of algorithms has not been something that the markets have been able to absorb on their own, and they have needed the appropriate regulation to do that. And this also aligns with economic theory. Along the lines of Bigou and Coase and others, who argue that only social costs call for regulation, but private costs do not. The standard recommendation of economic theory would be that if algorithmic inflexibility creates costs for the agent who is using the algorithms, this does not call for regulation. And that's because the agent who is using the algorithm internalizes these costs and takes action to avoid them. By contrast, when using an algorithm by one agent creates cost for other agents, for example, because coding errors can lead to flash crashes, there is an externality that market forces may fail to address, and in this case, regulation may be necessary. And this means that distinguishing the two types of inflexibility in algorithmic contracting and respective regulation on financial markets is in line with economic theory, which says that externalities call for regulation, but private costs do not. And so, to conclude this, the argument of our paper can be summarized as follows. The inflexibility of using algorithms in contracting is criticized as a drawback, but this claim needs re-examination, as we have done, in light of theory and empirical evidence. Secondly, the inflexibility has a dual nature. We can detect it on the level of transactions and on the level of markets. And thirdly, when we look at financial markets, regulation only targets the second type of inflexibility, which aligns with economic theory. And finally, if algorithmic contracts are to become widespread, which we see happening as we speak, we need to identify the social costs and changes, then respectively in law and regulation that help to mitigate these costs. And so of course, there's a further question whether economic theory is right, but I think the first question here is what are the social costs of contracting algorithms and of the use of algorithmic contracts and smart contracts. So these were the preliminary remarks, which were quite long, but hopefully they were helpful for understanding the paper. And I really look forward to hearing your feedback and questions and having the discussion with you, because it's definitely the question that was done and on the very last point here is something that I want to think about further. What are the social costs and how do we see them on the markets?
Okay, so anyway, I want to start with, are there any questions? I can start with the help you. So, bye. Okay, now you can hear me.
Do you want to come here?
No, don't worry. I have quite a few questions, but is there somebody else that wants to start? Otherwise, I'll just go. Okay, so the first one would be, that is a lawyer's question. Then I have a law and economics guy kind of question, and then I have another like a case that I think you could consider in your analysis. I want to know what you think about that. So the lawyer's question would be, so the dogmatic lawyer question would be, what do we gain by qualifying smart contracts or algorithmic contracts as contracts? So is the idea that if we qualify them as contracts, should we apply contract law to them? Do we gain anything useful by applying contract law to them, or should we rather consider them as a new category that we could regulate in a different way? You know, there's all this tendency of fragmenting a contract law. So there's the consumer law at European level, then there's all the B2B with big B and small b, like big business and small business kind of interaction. There's all the debate around also platforms where, the idea of having the platform playing a role even when it's not directly involved in the contract, that also is another way of challenging contract law. So there is a tendency that has emerged over the years in fragmenting the notion of contract that has always been very uniform. It's one of the oldest notions of the legal system. So, and the idea that the traditional top-down approach that all lawyers, continental lawyers maintain, wants to bring everything under one big umbrella, and so, but there is this, opposite tendency to fragment the notion of contract. So would this be another case where we can further fragment the notion of contract and say, okay, we can call it contract, but we would benefit more from creating a different category? So that would be the one thing. The other issue.
Do you mind if
yes.
we do it question by question?
Yes,
sure. I think then we can get the conversation going. And of course, yes. I would be hugely interested in hearing your perspective on the same question as well. You explained it so well. I think there are many ways of responding to this question. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is indeed something that a dogmatic lawyer would say. I think we also see that in the recent reports, let's say, for example, by the UK Law Commission, they try to see how to accommodate new technology in the framework of the current law. Right, and if parties want to agree on something and want to hold each other accountable, they see that, well, we have a legal framework for that already, and the technological means themselves shouldn't matter. So if the parties want to have an agreement and they have concluded it in code, then why should the code matter? It's the agreement that matters eventually, and we can apply contract law to this agreement. So this is the argument, I think, for using the current contract law and applying it just across technologies. I think maybe
To further clarify, yes, I understand this, but my question when I do these kind of studies, when I do my law and technology kind of analysis, is I really don't like this traditional lawyer's approach in the sense that I like to ask whether does it work, or would we benefit from having an alternative category? You know, you can apply the product liability directive. This is something that I have been working extensively on to a number of advanced technologies, besides the problems with software and so on. But the question is, do we want to apply it? Because, okay, let's assume that we can apply it, because let's say that we can qualify these things as contracts. Is it actually beneficial doing that? Or would we rather benefit from saying, okay, this is something different, and because of its difference, rather than stressing similarities, let's say, stressing differences, and then using that to argue in favor of different approaches, different regulation, you know. So the fact that you can do it, you can address it with pre-existing tools, does not say that we cannot conceive better tools. We cannot have a preferable approach.
And of course, this is an argument for legal innovation in a way, thinking about what could be better than our existing framework, and I completely support that approach in the sense that, yes, let's go forward and discuss that and see what could be a potentially better approach here. Yeah, so it's difficult to say right now whether we need something further or not. So the recent UK Law Commission report says basically that there is no question these are contracts and we can hold the parties accountable, but we also see from cases around the world which arise when we talk about smart contracts-based trading, let's say in cryptocurrencies, that the current contract law does not function well, that the categories that we have in the current contract law do not accord with the kinds of changes in the nature of the private relations that are brought about by the technology. So I'm currently thinking about a case that happened in Singapore, where maybe you're familiar with a case from, I think it's 2020, case Coin versus, what was that, B2K2 partner. So anyway, so there were two companies. One offered a platform for buying and exchanging Bitcoin and Ether, and another one then was interested in trading on that platform. And for some reason, on the original platforms that was operated by a currency exchange called Coin, for some reason their price algorithms malfunctioned, which meant that they showed the lowest prices for the cryptocurrencies and traded on those lowest prices. And once they detected that mistake, they of course immediately reversed the exchanges. But the party who had benefited from that exchange already, who had already bought the cryptocurrencies, of course challenged the reversal because they wanted to benefit. And the court found that there was a mistake, yes. So it actually upheld, it reversed the reversal. So it upheld the claim of the party who had performed the exchange and said that there was a mistake unilateral mistake on the part of the platform. But it felt like it was an unfair decision. So it felt like there was something wrong with the decision, that the court didn't have the tools that it needed to handle this type of case. So maybe it's necessary to have additional categories in contract law for addressing these types of situations. Maybe there have to be some kinds of security measures in place. And I see, looking at financial trading, that the regulatory tools are extensive and the requirements for making the trading platforms secure are extensive. But I cannot imagine that happening in consumer-based, consumers trading algorithms, so consumer algorithmic contracts. It's kind of unthinkable to make consumers, or also businesses, small businesses, to operate with very heavy regulatory burden. So I think that's unthinkable. So this actually might be an argument towards thinking about a new regime, or at least additional categories for the protection of interests of those non-professional users of contracting algorithms.
So I didn't know the case, but I'll look it up because it sounds very interesting. That case, actually, I think, as a contract lawyer, that I would find quite okay to address it through mistake. I would like to read the case and the reasoning of the judges, and I don't know how you said it's in Korea or Singapore?
It's Singapore.
Singapore. So I know nothing about Singapore contract law, so I don't know whether they abide like more similar to the European approach or to the North American one on
It's a
mistake.
very nice summary of the case by Eliza Mick.
Okay,
you might want to.
I'll look it up.
I can send it to you.
Great, and then I'll play the law and economist guy. So going back to our attempts at Yale, I was thinking of some work by, I think it was Professor Choi on strategic contractual incompleteness, and which is something that. So I did a lot of research on how to complete incomplete contracts through the use of good faith and elastic clauses, the way we like so much in continental Europe. Because very often you find that there are interests that are not regulated in details in the contract. But then, while doing this research, I also came across, during our Yale times, this article that said that very often parties select contractual incompleteness as desirable because if they were to negotiate each and every term of the contract, they would never come to an agreement. So they'd rather get a risk of not having regulated something, leaving their contract incomplete, because maybe if they did address one specific future scenario, world scenario, that then they would not agree on that and they would never come to an agreement in the end, and what would be otherwise a beneficial contract would never be entered into. So actually, there could be a strategic choice from a rational player to leave the contract incomplete. So the idea of incompleteness is not necessarily a problem. So this is to say that in some cases having contracts that are incomplete is actually what the parties want, which leads me again to more or less the same kind of argument that was made. So the need and the fact that it's actually beneficial to differentiate algorithmic contracts from normal contracts, because you might want to be able to choose between two very different things. Something that is truly inflexible, because inflexibility can be profitable. And I remember also some studies by Henry Hansman on hand-tying contracts. So contracts where you can make sure that you're limiting your future possibility of change in mind, renegotiation, and so on and so forth. And that also minimizes transaction costs. But there's also the opposite need, that sometimes to leave the contract incomplete. So again, this suggests to me that I find your paper really interesting, but I would not worry so much with qualifying algorithmic contracts as contracts, because maybe really there is also an efficiency element in differentiating them. Because if contracts, traditional contracts as they are regulated currently in civil codes or through case law, are to be preserved as the flexible tool for incomplete kind of agreements, this could be the opposite side of the spectrum, and the inflexibility being actually the characterizing and positive element of the transaction, of the category, rather than something that we need to demonstrate it's not really there, or actually. So it's just, a broader tool set. And in this sense, I see a great opportunity in consumer law, in the sense that consumer law is typically that field where there are contracts, and maybe, I don't know what you think about that, whether this other case study could be added, or maybe you could write another paper on this case study, but another sector next to financial markets, I see very well the example why financial markets like the inflexibility kind of element, but I was thinking also in consumer law, in many cases of consumer law, contracts are unilaterally defined by the professional and the consumer just opts in and takes the contract as it is. Now imagine, for instance, a very simple example, a transportation contract with an airline. If that is unilaterally determined, you never read the terms of that agreement. If that was turned into an inflexible algorithmic contract, the moment that I land with 3 hours delay, I don't even need to file a paper to be reimbursed for the delay. or when my luggage, like it happened recently, gets lost.
I'm just thinking about my yesterday's experience.
Yes, exactly. I was
with the
thinking my luggage got lost and damaged 2 weeks ago when I was flying back from Lisbon, and I had to go through some hurdle, and it was very annoying, and I really wanted to do that because it was an expensive brand new suitcase that got destroyed, but pushing myself through to do that was quite annoying and stressful, and I don't need flexibility there. Inflexibility there is actually another very good point. And I would see many cases for like a consumer sales contract where inflexibility is actually what I am seeking and automation is what I'm seeking. So I would see this as another very good example, case study where you could apply your kind of reasoning. And that, again, would confirm, in my perspective, my intuition that I would not try to say that these are contracts and the traditional contract law rules apply, but I would really, my kind of argument based on what you're saying would be, okay, this is a new category that we can include in the legal system that is beneficial, that serves a purpose, and that has these case studies where you can apply it profitably with, but differentiating it. Like really keeping it separate and identifying those rules that would be best suited for addressing them. So
I think Frank.
Yeah.
On that, just 1 second.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question. So I have a series of questions later on. But since one was connected to what Andrea was saying now, I'll just use this opportunity and ask that directly. Can you help me clarify a bit what exactly, so that was the first part of your presentation, what exactly would for you be an algorithmic contract? Because, for example, what Andrea just described, maybe I'm wrong, but I would not qualify it as an algorithmic contract. I would qualify it as a smart contract that automatically kind of execute itself. Would that be correct also under your understanding, or am I getting lost in the different type of interaction between technology and contracting? That was it. Then I'll follow up with other things.
Okay. So let me try to respond to one question is, of course, about the definition itself, and another one is about inflexibility and where it is useful and where it is not, and whether that actually leads us to thinking whether the current contract law, again, is suitable for dealing with the new technologies. So what is a smart contract? Smart contract is actually a script which executes itself, and it doesn't amount necessarily to a contract at all. So what needs to exist in addition to the smart contract is an agreement between the parties, which can be in code, but it can be also somehow framed in natural language. In a way, what's necessary is the contractual stack of things. You need the environment where certain rules of contract law apply, then you need an agreement between the parties, and then there is a smart contract which sort of executes the agreement. So there has been discussion about whether smart contract itself could be a contract which can just exist without a separate agreement between the parties, or between. But what you still need, in addition to the code, is the intention of the parties to be bound, and so that is still additional to the code itself. So if you think about algorithmic contract, I think algorithmic contract is a much better term to use for describing this kind of contractual stack, where the intention is there, where the terms of the contract are there, and where there is also a script which executes the agreement. And algorithmic contract could also be something that then automates all elements of the contract. So when you think about the slide that I had on contract lifecycle, then we talk about algorithmic contract in the case of where only part of the contract is automated, or also when all of the contract is automated.
But again, then in Andrea's example on the flight, the problem with the flight, etc., that the problem would be the kind of automatic, what was it, like a compensation? What exactly kind of he was figuring out? The reimbursement, okay. So the automatic reimbursement of the flight, or the compensation of the damage that you're entitled to due to statutory law, whatever it is. it's not necessarily the like the identification of the party and the definition of the content of the contract, etc., etc. It's a different type. So I would understand that as a different type of agreement than the ones, a different type of phenomenon than the ones that you were kind of using as the parameter of your talk. Is it correct?
So, but you could think about this kind of agreement that if something fails in a flight, then the flight company, on the basis of your purchase of the ticket from the flight company, is then bound to compensate to you. So it depends on what the relationship is like. Is it a relationship between you and the flight provider, or is it a relationship between you and your insurance? And so those contracts are different. I think I imagine having a claim under both of those relations. And to trigger this kind of execution then of the reimbursement automatically, there is a need for additional information, which in smart contracts, if there would be a smart contract which would execute this kind of reimbursement, they would need to get the information through the oracles, which are then programmed into the smart contracts to get the flight was late and your luggage was damaged, right? So this kind of information needs to flow in there. It's not unthinkable, but I don't see currently that this would show the need for different kind of regulatory mechanism. It seems doable under the current regulatory mechanism. Now, I'd like to make a comment, but I mean, I don't say that we don't need a new one if the new one could be, if the new regulatory mechanism could be useful. So I would like to keep this discussion actually open, but it would be really wonderful to then take this case as an example and consider what could be an alternative regulatory mechanism, and then sort of evaluate that and do sort of a careful study on that. I think it's a very interesting path to take. Now about the inflexibilities. So I think just to clarify the talk a bit, so in the first part, I said what the criticism is, and the criticism is that there is inflexibility which cancels out the algorithmic contracts or automated contracts. So the idea is that there's inflexibility, but because of that inflexibility, those contracts cannot operate. And we are saying that yes, there is inflexibility, but this inflexibility actually has been very operational on the financial markets. It's been very beneficial, and the parties have internalized the cost of the inflexibility on the level of transactions, and so on the individual level for themselves. So this is financial markets are sort of a good example of the beneficial use of inflexibility, showing also that inflexibility in contracting algorithms more generally could be beneficial. So there is definitely a path for taking that, because financial markets show us that there is this path. But at the same time, there is this inflexibility on the level of markets, so the systemic risks which sort of make behavior on the markets more complicated because of the low human involvement and the high speeds. So this kind of inflexibility does require regulatory response, because it's something that the parties themselves are not able to handle. So this is the social cost of the social costs which needs to be mitigated, not on the individual level, but on the communal level, ideally through regulation. Or when we think about contracting algorithms, it doesn't necessarily have to be regulation. It could be some other measures. But I don't have right now sort of a good suggestion what those measures could be. But again, that's a very good way.
One thing that is sometimes said, and this, I think that the issue of high-frequency trading and trading algorithms is also one where I see room for consideration of legal personality of the algorithm and not necessarily contra law. For instance, I'm not so much in favor of attributing machines rights and obligations. The only reason why I would consider something like that is on purely instrumental grounds. So like we do with corporations, we attribute rights to corporations because we want to have a different tax regime, because we want to separate assets of the corporation from the shareholders, from the personal assets of the shareholders. And we want to simplify contractual relationships. So these are the classical law and economics arguments why we want corporations to be regulated as such and not through merely contracts. And in some cases, like high-frequency trading, you could consider attributing the algorithm itself the nature of a legal person, the same way of a corporation, and have it operate on the market being registered so that you can track it down, understand where it has been used, and eventually there are rooms for damages, maybe whenever damages are caused from the functioning of the trading algorithm, you can make the algorithm with its own assets responsible to compensate that damage. So I don't know, I didn't think through this enough, but this is one of the cases where maybe also that could be a tool. What I was trying to say is that really one of the claims that I found, at least in the Italian literature, of those scholars that are discussing on smart contracts, is they really are obsessed with the fact that you cannot find all the elements of a traditional contract. And my best response to that would be, why would I want to? Not because because if you put it in a policy perspective, you don't need to put it in that basket because not everything what is in that basket actually, if not everything what is in that basket is suitable, who cares, you know? For instance, under the Italian Civil Code, there is an article that says that so we regulate contracts, and then we say, and our definition of contract is that contracts are necessarily bilateral. So contracts under Italian law have to have at least two parties. It could be more, but at least two are necessary, which is different than saying obligations for both parties. There can be contracts that have obligations on just one party, but there are two parties. So, and then we have unilateral acts when there is just one party that is making a declaration and the other one, and there is no other one, or eventually there is somebody that is receiving the declaration, but it's not. And there is an article, just one article on unilateral acts that says the principles for contracts apply to unilateral acts. So
Principles of what?
the norms that regulate the contracts apply to unilateral acts so long as they are compatible. And that's a very wise way of regulating, in the sense that it says so long as the unilateral acts pose problems that are comparable to those of contracts, you can apply contract rules. But you do not need to demonstrate that a unilateral act is a contract. And you can, through that norm, you can select those norms of contract law that are applicable to unilateral acts, and you do not need to apply the whole thing to unilateral acts. Okay, so you can only apply those that are relevant for unilateral acts. So when I see all this debate, at least in Italy, it's very much diffused on smart contracts, where there's a lot of stress on the fact that can we really define these on contracts? I find that very doctrinal and very boring. And I would say, who cares? So my answer would be to that, the short answer would be, who cares? Actually, I want to stress on the differences. And I agree that many things can actually apply, and I don't see room, I see room for regulation to protect third parties that are not involved in the contract. Yes, that's a very good point. But also in selecting some of the norms that you might not want to apply. So the fact that you cannot apply traditional principles of contractual interpretation to smart contracts, I don't see that as a problem because I don't want to. I want smart contracts precisely because I don't want to apply the norms of interpretation. I want all the debate, all the doctrinal debate around smart contracts has to do with around traditional contracts has to do with making them more flexible so that they can accommodate changing circumstances. And so the fact that these are inflexible, I think this is a distinguishing element that is the beneficial element of the category. So why wouldn't, so there is even in contractual interpretation theory, the four-corner rule that is applied in the common law is considered to be an element of value in many circumstances. So why wouldn't we want something that is inflexible when inflexibility is an advantage? So.
Right, and so making the smart contracts more flexible actually defeats their purpose. So, which is something that's in the criticism that I described was also pointed to, right? So when you make them flexible, they are just like minimal development in technology. They are not the kind of disruptive technology that could be available to us. It's very interesting, though, that you have this debate on how smart contracts comply with or qualify under the contract law. This is a philosophical interesting debate, but I'm not sure whether the current lawyers that you referred to actually take it philosophically. So maybe if they take it doctrinally, right. But for me, philosophically, actually, what's very interesting is that when there is, and I wouldn't actually talk about smart contracts, I would rather talk about algorithmic contracts, because because of the confusion of the language, which we just talked about before. But with an algorithmic contract, when you program it in the very beginning, together with the execution of all the agreement that has been reached between the parties, what happens is that it seems to me that the parties sort of don't have, it's difficult to talk about their obligation anymore, because at the moment of agreeing to something they have already performed the obligation, and which makes it sort of superfluent or impossible to talk about the party being obliged to fulfill their part of the contract. And also it makes, thinking about law and economics, it makes it difficult to say that the party is has a choice about either fulfilling their obligations or defaulting on the obligations, because it's more efficient. And so this kind of debate in case of fully automated contracts falls off. And I wonder whether this is something that distinguishes those contracts from our typical traditional contracts. Because if you don't have an obligation and you don't have an opportunity to hold the other party accountable for fulfilling their obligation, I wonder whether it's only a linguistic matter or it's actually a substantive matter as well. Of course, it's definitely a linguistic matter, but maybe it is substantive in the sense that the obligation is always fulfilled at the moment of already agreeing to the contract. And there has to be a mechanism if we want to still allow parties to default on their obligation, which is something that in law and economics literature we see a lot, discussed a lot, and it's sort of a natural part of a contract, that you have this choice there, either to fulfill the obligation or not to fulfill. So if we have those fully automated contracts, do we want to have an additional mechanism, let's say an obligatory mechanism, for changing the conditions, or for follow-on action if a party wants to default? And again, if we have this follow-on sort of obligation or follow-on some kind of code there, would this defeat the purpose of the original automation overall? And so I think that complicates the matter. What is an obligation in algorithmic contracts? But it's definitely something I want to think about further. I don't have answers here.
Okay, so my other question is, the way I understand your argument, and correct me at any time if I'm misrepresenting it, is that basically this inflexibility of automated contracts is not necessarily negative. You have situation, like if you address it from an individual level, so the individual transaction, then you have a lot of benefits because of it, and it's manageable at the type of risk that you have and the type of inflexibility that you have could actually be a positive one in terms of holding the parties accountable, etc., etc. On the other, and the cost itself at individual levels are manageable.
I'm not saying actually that they are manageable.
Okay.
I'm saying that what the financial markets example shows us is that on the individual level, on the individual level of transactions, parties have internalized the costs of the inflexibility. But it doesn't mean that in all circumstances those costs are manageable, which also, for me, calls up the question whether regulation should address the individual costs.
Okay.
For example, on consumer markets.
Okay, I understand that. So with that correction, on the other thing that you said, and again, correct me if I'm misrepresenting it, is that if you see the interaction of, or like how this inflexibility operates at a more systemic level, then the reason why this type of contract could actually be beneficial, or still, again, they could work, is because institution can react to the risks, the very specific systemic risks that they create, and especially if this type of risks are creating social cost, even though we still have to identify exactly which they are. I mean, there is room for accommodating it, and through regulation, creating a convenient normative framework where this contract operate. So if this is the case, my question is kind of, is a bit kind of on the side of this argument, but I just needed to understand better where you're going, which is what type of social benefit would you have from automated contracts in various settings? So not just referring to the financial market setting, but more broadly speaking, because I understand your argument as identifying some benefits at the individual transaction level, but then I don't see that kind of being brought at a broader, more systemic dimension, other than what I understand it to be the aggregation of the individual benefits. And so I was wondering whether you think that there are very peculiar contracts other than just a case study that could benefit from it, or situation where you would lead to a broader regulatory intervention, kind of challenging and pushing for regulatory intervention that would be beneficial, but not because it's reacting to a new risk that it's created because of the automation, but because that area of law, that area of market is better suited to this type of contracts than the other ones. Did I make myself clear?
I think we will need to think about this together with you.
Okay.
Because it is a challenge that I'm sort of thinking about how to think about. Basically, what are the social costs of using automated contracting on the non-financial market, in the non-financial market context. And so one thing that I think about is the cryptocurrency exchanges and people's interest in using cryptocurrencies and the exchanges being fully automated or nearly fully automated. So definitely individuals are willing to internalize the costs there of building the algorithms and building their profile that is needed to participate in those exchanges. It's a cost that they are willing to adopt in order to benefit from the exchanges on that market. They also seems willing to internalize the risk of the failure of those transactions. Mm-hmm. And so because the regulatory environment is not so supportive for the traders there. Mm-hmm. They are not professional parties, but the courts interpret the trades on the basis of traditional contract law, which doesn't accord fully with the technology. And as we saw in the Singapore case, there was a decision by the court which we might agree with, but at the same time might also not agree with, so it's not fully clear. Another example, aside from the cryptocurrency exchanges, is just the platform economy, basically. And so all kinds of transactions on platforms, or if you think about even the Bolt drivers or the Uber drivers, so all those transactions take place to a large extent automatically, except that, of course, when you're driving by a car, then okay, that part is not automated, obviously. But there are transactions on those platforms which are to a large extent fully automated. Mm-hmm. And so those, if the risks related to those are not mitigated, those could be the social costs that we might want to talk about. Yeah. But at the moment, I see individuals just internalizing those costs, and also not entering markets where they feel that they are not willing to internalize the costs. Yeah. And so if I don't have a sufficient sense of security, I don't have sufficient trust about an environment where I'd like to operate, let's say with my cryptocurrencies, let's say in a foreign part of the world, I just don't enter that market because I'm not exactly sure if I get, if the trade fails, if the transaction fails, then who will protect my interests, and I'm just not entering those markets. So potentially there are social costs in the sense of not being able to enter markets, and we could minimize the risk of entering those markets by dealing with those costs then that come with the cross-jurisdictional.
Okay, so using the inflexibility element, could you take the last scenario that you identified and actually turn it so I'm not able to enter into a market or not able to kind of have a specific service, etc., etc. Can we put it as a benefit instead of a social, instead of a cost? So I'll explain why I'm thinking about that. It's actually connected to the conversation that we had yesterday about the limitation of individual will to commit to specific kind of dimension of the platform economy that could be negative for the individual himself. So what I was thinking is, can we imagine let's say a scenario where we have, I don't know, many different social networks and not just one that are operating on a competitive dimension, and I'm completely free to switch because I'm not locked in as I actually am in reality. And let's imagine that I have a very clear identification of what, again, if asked, my preference or privacy setting or things like that are identified. But that's exactly the type of preference that I would not abide to, or that I would not respect when I have to deal with, going through all the legal specification and understanding exactly how it works, and then switching or checking every 2 days whether WhatsApp changed its terms of use, etc., etc. So I have some type of software that allows me, where I kind of say what type of platform I would like to use, and it kind of checks for me constantly that I'm using the platform that matches the preferences that otherwise I would not be able to stick up to, because I'm not as rational as I want.
And you're thinking whether inflexibility somehow
Would that be...
is that helpful? But it looks, well, at least with the example of platforms, it seems that we don't talk about just one transaction, but such a broad range of transactions, where I, as a person, am involved with my preferences and my changing preferences as well. So if my preferences change, I'm not sure whether inflexibility is to my benefit. But it might, if I...
But that could be seen as, I don't know, I'm really thinking out loud, but can we imagine a sort of update to this instruction on how to perform contracts? Because the way I would normally imagine the settings that you're presenting is immediately for, let's say it's for immediate transaction, something fast that it's executed immediately, etc., etc. Not for, but maybe I'm wrong, but not for relational contracts, where I'm kind of setting the basis of whatever needs to happen over time with that contractual party, and where the indeterminacy, as Andrea was saying before, is actually something positive. So would it still be something relevant for your research, or would it still fall within that type of analysis, a setting where you're able to switch the instruction on how to perform the contract? Would that be correct? And then I'll tell you why this is particularly interesting for me, but let's see.
I'm very curious about why this is interesting for you, but for me this aligns with the previous paper that we wrote together with Maria Jose, where we distinguished between the trust mechanisms that operate in different contexts. The first context was the first personal context. So in the first personal context, basically I trust myself and I enforce norms based on my own conscience. In the second personal context, it is exactly the relational context, but also business relations and so on. So all the agreements are enforced by the force of the relations that we have with each other. Actually, I think we perform our legal obligations very much due to the relational reasons rather than the law enforcement reasons as well. But just as that's a side comment. And the third one was sort of a third personal context, which is operational on law and the law enforcement and the sort of the force of the law. And the fourth context was the sort of technological enforcement context, where we put the smart contracts and the algorithmic contracts, and where sort of the agreements are enforced by the help of technology. And we said that the trust in each of those different contexts is different. So there is trust to myself, trust between friends or partners. There is a trust which is based on the legal context, so understanding common rules and trusting the enforcement that's operational in the legal system. And then the fourth is something that bases trust or reliance on the technology. There is a company in Estonia which is called Guardtime and which develops blockchain, and they basically say it's a no trust system or no. They have a very nice term for it. So they basically say that you don't need to rely on it; you just can use it. But it's a very good company in the sense that it's a very very qualified and has a technology which I would definitely suggest looking into. It's also used in Estonian e-governance system, and I think it has been very active also in the COVID context across Europe. But in any case, so they use the blockchain and the permission blockchain for verifying transactions, and they say that the system is something that's called a zero trust system. So anyway, having those contexts in mind, I think the technological enforcement sort of belongs into one category, but the relational contracts belong into another, and it's difficult to merge them.
Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We have plenty of questions from the online audience, so can you...
Oh, wow, that's wonderful.
It's not nice to have everything online, but it's...
Thanks to the online audience, and I'm hoping now that Raquel can ask the questions.
Sure. So the first one is about the parallel between algorithmic trading and other instances of contract automation in retail markets. So while in trading venues, those that use algo trading are normally well-structured financial firms, that are also able to internalize the individual risks. Is it always the case in retail markets, both financial and non-financial? And then, when it is not, maybe some sort of regulation, even on the micro inflexibility, can be justified.
I see that you're reading from your phone. Would you mind if I read that question? Because it seems that I need to have a look at it once more to understand the question. Just to make sure that. Okay, great.
Also.
So that's the first one here.
Yes.
Okay.
That's one.
This one?
No.
No, this one. Okay. The parallel between algorithmic trading and other instances of contract automation in retail markets. So while in trading venues, those that use algorithmic trading are normally well-structured financial firms that bargain with other financial firms and thus succeed in internalizing the individual risks. Is it always the case in retail markets? Maybe when it is not, some sort of regulation even on the micro inflexibility can be justified. Yes, so I'll put it here. This is actually the point that I made very briefly in response to something that Francesca said earlier, which is that, yes, we are currently, so on the very last slide, we ask, what are the social costs of using algorithmic contracts on non-financial markets that we need to identify in order to discuss what the regulation could be and how to mitigate the social costs there. But actually an additional question that I have myself is that whether the individuals operating on the retail market, as the person who asked the question mentioned, whether those individual costs have to be internalized by the individuals themselves, or would it be too much for us to demand of them? So currently it's difficult to characterize the retail markets, because while the development of algorithmic contracts is really booming, in the sense we see many companies trying to develop the appropriate programming languages and discussing which languages would be the best for having in algorithmic contracts. And we see a huge interest in the insurance industry, actually referring to the flight example, so huge interest in the insurance industry in using algorithmic contracts in their operations. we cannot talk about the very broad retail markets, but I think here's a good parallel to draw with consumer markets. So when we see those algorithmic contracts actually entering more into the retail market, where we see businesses and consumers operating, and we see that they have a very high need to internalize lots of costs, then we might want to lower those costs in order to make the markets operational in a better manner, so that the burden of entering the market wouldn't be too high for individuals. I think it's a matter of leveling the playing field for people for entering the market, but also just sort of normalizing a market which operates on the basis of algorithmic contracts, just like we have normalized various kinds of consumer relations, so that those wouldn't have too high of a burden. Do you want to show the next question?
Yes, that is follow-up to a question. Yes, this one that Francesca asked me for.
Aha. Building on Francesca's last point, Francesca, your last point, one of the justifications for the MiFID II's regulation on algorithmic trading in financial markets is their critical contribution to market liquidity and efficiency, which is inherent to the role of informed traders in financial markets. Is there a correspondent super individual benefit of automating contracts in other kinds of markets? That's a very good question. And so I think the simple answer is that it's difficult to talk about currently those retail markets where algorithmic contracts would be operational, because we are sort of looking into the future right now. We don't have those markets operational yet. And so it's a very good question to ask, what would be the super individual benefit of automating contracts? So what would benefit on the retail markets from the fact that people are able to engage in algorithmic contracting? So I think the immediate thought is that we would just be able to give people access to other markets. And so in the globalization context, we are interested in so many other places in the world than our local community. And I think being able to trade more securely with those other locations is one benefit that we can talk about. And I think that wouldn't be just an individual benefit, but it would be a benefit which has sort of a global impact. So it would be super individual in this sense. But that's a very quick first thought here. That's a very good question again. Thanks.
Okay.
Was that all?
We can, if we have time,
I think yes.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes.
so I would say yes.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is, would the adoption of strict liability be suitable for tackling risks arising from algorithmic stablecoins? Take, for example, the so-called stablecoin Luna, which crashed 2 weeks ago, stripping many holders of their savings invested in Luna. So I think this is a question to you, Andrea. So about thinking about how to organize contract law so that it would be suitable for contract automation. So whether we would need to use the tools of the current contract law, or we would need to think about a new regime. And the person asking the question asks, would the adoption of strict liability be suitable for tackling risks arising from algorithmic stable coins?
Liability law. I think the person that asked the question knows it.
So the answer is that Andrea says yes, but I think what the value of this question is that it really provokes to think about to what extent the current legal regime is suitable to dealing with the cryptocurrencies that we have right now.
So about this, I like to always say one thing. I like to say that I always use the quote of an
Would you
Italian.
like to have a microphone?
Yes. On this matter, I always use to quote an Italian law school professor that is very much against law and economics, even if he says that he is an alumnus from Guido Calabresi and he did some research period at Yale, even if because of his age, there was no LLM program back then. So, and this guy is a very smart doctrinal guy, but he says that diritti secondis, so specialized fields of the law, can trigger questions that require different approaches and different answers from the general principles that you had up until that moment. And then by thinking of those extreme examples, you elaborate one solution, and then maybe you realize after finding that solution can become the new general rule because it's preferable even in other domains. So I think when he wrote this paper, he was talking about competition law, because competition law was the new thing back then, many years ago. But I think this can apply here as well. So I'm not an expert in cryptocurrencies. I supervised a dissertation on tokenization, not cryptocurrencies though. And I do believe that in those domains, when it comes to civil liability, I'm always in favor of strict forms of liability that do not require a too attentive assessment of the element of fault and also of causation in some cases, when there is a clear internalization of costs. In this case, I really didn't think the example through so that I could provide a more detailed answer.
But can I ask you,
yes,
why in other fields you would be in favor of strict liability?
The idea is that I disentangle the ex ante function of deterrence that I think liability rules very often do not achieve anyway from the ex post function of compensation. And I think that in terms of providing so deterrence is better pursued through other bodies of norms, and compensation can be very well achieved through liability rules, but those should actually burden the party that is best positioned to internalize the risk, irrespective of other considerations. And I think that there are examples also in European law that are very efficient, in the sense, for instance, that consumer sales directive is very efficient, because whenever you buy something and it lacks conformity to what has been promised, you can go to the place where you bought it that is definitely not responsible for the lack of conformity, because typically they just sold you the product as being the final retailer. And then you can go there and have the item replaced, repaired, or your money back directly from that clear entry point of your complaint, that is the reseller, the person you had a relationship with. And if you were to discuss it under the perspective of ex ante deterrence, that norm doesn't provide any deterrence, because it doesn't affect in any way the behavior of the reseller, because the reseller cannot do much about the quality of the product that he hands over to you. If you buy a computer, it's defective, he didn't know, he couldn't check it. It's just that he bought it and delivered to you, and then he can climb up the value chain and sue the other parties in recourse, but he is your clear entry point of litigation. Now, this is not liability, that is a warranty, and there is a difference between a warranty and a liability rule. But I think that in some cases the threshold can be a little bit more blurred, and this kind of rationale in many cases simplifies the overall picture very much, and can help internalize costs. And because in advanced technologies the issue is always apportionment, because there are multiple factors that might contribute to the same harmful event, and those factors are very hard to disentangle one from the other, then it's maybe best to say, okay, you claimant, you know that you only have to target that one person, because that is the person that the law points at, the one-stop shop, like they call it in Brussels. And then from there on, further litigation can occur, or eventual contractual agreements can occur, and transfer the economic loss to the other parties that were truly involved. And also, ultimately, in a recent paper that I wrote for the European Journal of Law and Economics, I say that liability rules are actually indifferent in the sense that who pays for the damage is always the same party, irrespective of the liability rules, because then there are also price mechanisms. So if I am the party that is being held responsible and I can decide about the price of the good that I'm selling, because I will be held responsible, I have to buy an insurance, what I will do is I will factor the cost of the insurance into the price, and and when you pay for the good that you're buying, the service that you're buying, you're also paying for the insurance that I had to buy. And this can induce internalization of costs, but also management of costs in a very efficient way, reducing litigation and so reducing the cost per dollar that you have to pay or per euro that you have to pay to obtain compensation. So this is the kind of
so there is a long discussion on this, and I think the response to the question here is that it's worth looking further into your work about those discussions. That's, I think, one takeaway from here. And another one is that I would like to thank those who asked the question in terms of raising very, very good questions for further thought. So it's not easy to respond immediately, but they definitely gave ideas for the next papers.
Is there any other question? No. Okay. Okay, well then, so we finished basically in time, and let me say that it was a very great pleasure having you with us here in Pisa, and it was a very interesting debate, and I thank you and all the persons here and those that are connected with us back home, and I invite you all to our new next EURA seminar. So have a nice day.
Thanks so much.